Hi Fred, how you doing? Just got back from a wonderful Living Colour gig. Just a phenomenally good band. So I thought, what'll I do to sort of come down after the Living Colour gig? So I thought I'll respond to Fred. So really enjoyed your last video as ever. Let's cut straight to it. I think we both want to try and compress these down a little bit and maybe try to get to it, if not a 5-minute limit, at least a 10-minute limit. So let's try that. So I've got 4 main points. The problem, Fred, I think with this one is I actually agree with you too much, which might be a bit of an issue in terms of the debate format. Maybe the first half I have very little of your most recent video. I have very little to complain about or very little to engage with because our positions are very similar. You still haven't answered my question though, and that just hangs in the air the whole time. In fact, when I asked you how do you justify another epistemology if it isn't on the basis of empirical evidence, the example you gave me is based on empirical evidence. We still haven't moved beyond that. So I'll get to that in a second. But first of all, the stuff we agree with. So on the screen, I think there are 4 sort of main points. First of all, there's good social science and there's bad social science. And I am certainly not a fan. You mentioned Sakal and you say that Sakal has cast a long shadow. I agree. And sometimes that long shadow has fallen over areas which is just unfair. There's an awful arrogance in some STEM subjects, among some STEM practitioners, some STEM academics, that, you know, the only thing that matters is STEM and every other subject is worthless. That's perhaps an extreme expression of the views, but you know, there's a spectrum of opinions and a spectrum of stances, with that certainly on one end of the spectrum. I don't believe that at all. I, in fact, was torn between doing English as a degree subject or doing physics. In Ireland, the education system is much broader and therefore much better. We have English and maths mandatory up until we leave school. And so I was torn between doing English, because I've always loved to write, and physics, as I say. So I have an awful lot of time for the arts and humanities. I have an awful lot of time for key areas of sociology and social science. I'm not suggesting for 1 second that science is the be-all and end-all. But let's go through these points. So good social science and bad social science, but there's also good science and bad science. I'll talk a little bit about that. And you made this very important point and distinction between true enough and truth. Again, that seems to be just reiterating my point from the last video. And then still, I'll stress again, this question remains: why favour one epistemology over the other? Give me a metric, give me an heuristic, give me a mechanism other than empiricism for choosing one particular epistemology over the other. Question is this: there's a major move towards big data and complexity and looking at very large systems with very many degrees of freedom, if we want to put it in those terms. And there's a huge and growing area called social physics. So if that social physics happens in a sociology department, is it somehow less valid than if it happens in a physics department? So there is good social science. And for example, here's a, computation and mathematical modelling in the social sciences, game theory in here, range of different cautions about overfitting data in terms of how we fit, thinking about noise, thinking about testing particular simulations, testing particular mathematical models, thinking about complexity, etc., etc., etc. Really good book, Cambridge University Press, as you can see. I'll just leave the title up there. Similarly, and I've mentioned this before in the context of other discussions I've had, Simon. Simon was a physicist, a condensed matter physicist, who moved over to sociology. So it seems striking that Simon, was he a real scientist before he moved to sociology and social science and then became a fake scientist? Or did he take across the same rigor he applied to his physics to think about, broader problems and the place of physics in society and the place of the scientific method and what that implications that has for policy and right across the board? So, a huge amount of time for social science. Some aspects of social science, or many aspects of social science. However, that's not to say that social science doesn't have its problems. And one is that there are certain areas in sociology and social science where there's a massive degree of style over substance. And coming back to the whole point of this debate, I see so many parallels between the type of impenetrable, inconsistent language that Peterson uses and an awful lot of what happens in the worst of social science. Here's an example from someone called Karen Barrett, which I use quite a bit. Just listen to this. Listen to the denseness of this. Listen to the impenetrability. And in fact, listening to Peterson trying to discuss his ideas with Harris in that podcast we keep referring to, it was Barrett that sprung to mind time and time again for me. Rather, matter is substance in its iterative, interactive becoming, not a thing but a doing, a congealing of agency. What the feck does that mean? It is morphologically active, responsive, generative and articulate. Matter is articulate? What sort of matter? In what sense is it articulate? Mattering is the ongoing, interactive differentiating of the world. Differentiating in what sense? You get the idea. So when Sokal, and this is not so long ago, this is within the last few years, Sokal's spoof, which we both agree was a very elegant and very brilliant spoof, was 20 years ago. In some areas of social science and sociology, that message, Sokal's message, hasn't got through. So, good science, bad science, good social science, bad social science. But that's taken us away from the central topic, which is the question of Peterson and truth. And I don't think your response, Fred, has brought me any more answers. So you mentioned true enough versus truth. The phrase that stuck in my mind when I watched your video is true as you're going to get, more true than something you'd find in scripture. Exactly. That's my position. That's not Peterson's position. That's my position. You're backing up my position, which is great. And as I said in the last video, you are playing devil's advocate here. You've got an exceptionally difficult task, much more difficult than me, because what Peterson says is entirely inconsistent. I noticed in the comments, and there's some great comments left under the videos, somebody says, yeah, but Peterson in one of his videos says that he's fully for science. So what? Doesn't matter what he says he's for. It's a question of whether his arguments are consistent. Anybody can claim to be for something or the other. The arguments have to be self-consistent, and the arguments are not self-consistent. True as you're going to get. Exactly. That's the best we can do in science. I'm not going to move away from that. I'm a scientist. I'm a physicist. I spend my life, thinking about data, thinking about analysing that data, thinking about trying to extract as much truth value from that data as possible. But just as, what's the probability to find somebody in the world who's exactly 6 feet tall? Exactly. What's the probability? 0. Probability 0. Because define exactly. And it's the same with science. We can move closer and closer to the truth, but there's always some degree of uncertainty there. Does that mean that science doesn't work? Of course science works. Science works incredibly well. Geez, I dedicate my bloody life to science. It's my career, it's my job, it's what I love. And what's remarkable is I can go down the lab now, do an experiment, measure the distance between silicon atoms and somebody on the other side of the world within experimental error. So as true as it gets, or as close enough, or as true enough as it gets, within experimental error, within the uncertainty, within the error bars, we can compare those and we find that they're the same. Remarkable. And that's, what better? There's your empirical evidence again. There's your empirical evidence. You still haven't given me an alternative to empirical evidence. And I'm going to close with this, Fred. Why favour one epistemology over the other? So you give me an example in terms of why it's been found that religious belief can prolong life. But you've used empiricism to justify your belief. You've used a measurement of lifespan in one case, no religious belief, versus measurement of lifespan in the case of religious belief. You've compared the two and you've used that to justify your belief. Or at least you've used that as the mechanism by which somebody can justify their belief. That's empiricism. That's exactly the point. You're using empirical measurements to justify a belief. Again, I'll ask again. I think we're to the next round we're going to close this up. But after these number of rounds, I've hugely enjoyed the discussion with you. I've learned a lot, but you still haven't addressed those questions right at the start, and in particular that. What mechanism do I use if it's not empiricism to favour one epistemology over the other? You've given me an example, but unfortunately that example has empiricism built right into it. Okay, I think we're on to our closing statements then. So I look forward to your next video, and hugely enjoying this. One thing I would suggest is that maybe after we do our closing statements, we pick out a number of the comments. I've been blown away by the comments. Thank you to the people leaving the comments. Dear me, you look at the quality of the comments there compared to the quality of the usual comments on YouTube. Oh, it's like orders of magnitude difference. Fantastic. It's exactly what we want. So I think it's only fair. I'd certainly be happy to do this, is to go down through those comments, pick out some of the more perhaps challenging ones, certainly the more interesting ones, and there were a lot of interesting ones, and maybe address those in another video. Don't know what you think about that. Have a great weekend. My ears are still ringing from Living Colour, but I look forward to your next video. See you, Fred. Bye.